This is Damprock, your host. Together with Bob Weber, Chief Recording Engineer and Video Producer, we'll be kicking off another in a series of podcasts featuring video interviews with artists, songwriters, musicians, and producers.
That's right, and the real bonus is the podcast will include photos, video clips, along with in-depth interviews, together with insight from our guests who have made significant contributions to the music industry, both locally and nationally, plus internationally.
I'm sure our listeners will be entertained with many of the personal stories centering around the process of recording and the art of making music. Non-musicians, fans of music, and musicians will find these podcasts entertaining, inspiring, and certainly insightful.
Today we continue the series with an interview with John Carsello, who was the studio manager for the Caribou Ranch Recording Studio, and who also recently was inducted into the Colorado Music Hall of Fame. Let's get started.
Well, here we are at KMG Studios in beautiful Boulder, Colorado. And we're here with two friends of mine. One I've just met, and Clark Hagan over there. This is John Carsello. You were part of the group from Caribou Ranch to be inducted into the Colorado Music Hall of Fame. Quite an honor. I bet that surprised you.
Oh, it was incredible. And seeing people you haven't seen for 45 years.
Oh, my gosh.
Gersio I've seen, the Gersios, because I went back to work for them after the studio closed. I went back to work at Caribou in 2003 till just recently, 3 years ago, 2015.
Wow.
14,
now,
15.
you mentioned Jim Gersio, who...
Yeah, he bought the ranch.
He
owned
bought
it.
the ranch originally, 2,600... It was 2,600 acres originally.
Originally, it was 3,000.
But he originated or built the studio at Caribou, which is outside of Nederland, Colorado.
Outside of Nederland, 3 miles north of town. And we didn't know where we were going. I didn't. I went to see the studio when I was touring with Chicago, being trained as a road manager by their road manager for one of Jim's other bands called Madura. And they were going to record in New York. They recorded their first album in New York, and they were recording their second one at Caribou. And I was touring with Chicago, learning the ropes. Wow. And we played Denver, and some of us came up to we said, hey, let's go up and look at that studio that Jim's building up there.
What possessed him to build a studio? At a studio at 8,600 feet above sea level.
Yeah, he. I don't know if we understood about all the altitude back then and everything, but it was Colorado, and he had a dream of doing an independent studio to get away from the New York scene and the Los Angeles scene. He had produced Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He had produced the Buckinghams in the 60s, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears Spinning Wheel, which was an incredibly successful record. So Jim, wanted out of that scene and built an independent studio. So we went up there to see it. We heard Caribou Ranch. We didn't know what to expect. The studio was still being built. No one was recording yet. It was boards and dirt, and we just went, wow, this is really nuts. Chicago had a day off, so we went up there, some of us, and it was amazing because they had a day. We looked around going, wow, we did get it. It's hard to conceive before it was built. And so later on, when Jim moved there, he called me because I had been associated with the company because of touring with Chicago and all that, and thought that I might want to come to work up there because I lived in Los Angeles. And so I went, well, where are you going to live? And he said, here. And he said, I want to get things done, and maybe you can help out. And the studio there wasn't a board in there yet, I don't think. They were using, what were they using?
MCI.
An MCI, yeah. And I don't think the first Barnstorm was done on the MCI, was it?
Yeah.
It was?
Mm-hmm.
What about the second one, Rocky Mountain Way? Was that the Olive?
No, I think that was the MCI.
The MCI also.
Up to Rick Derringer.
Yeah, so
Chicago.
Bill Simzik brought Derringer in, and that was really the first band where I was in the office working,
In the office?
But it was amazing.
So I'm curious about, not only was it a studio, but he really created kind of a lifestyle that could house musicians that came
30,
there.
40 people.
Yes, and
the cabins.
Kind of create a lifestyle which I can imagine going up there to record. after you've been on the road and you've been in hotel after hotel, that was a breath of fresh air, no pun intended.
Yeah. Well, the altitude did get to people later. I didn't know what altitude from anything. I didn't know how high the mountains were. I didn't know anything. We came up there, you could get dehydrated. You could walk. When you walk west, you're walking uphill, and you're out of breath walking to your cabin. We didn't know any of this kind of stuff. And the wind, So the studio later, they knew the wind, apparently, was these carpenters and the people that built the studio. Barn got hit by 100-mile-an-hour, 120-mile-an-hour winds. Okay. So the control room, it was on the second floor surrounded by foam and insulation, you could sit in there and hear a pin drop during a blizzard.
Didn't they build the studio inside the barn?
Yes.
So it was like a building within a building.
It was a building with the studio and the control room and the recording studio were completely surrounded by foam. And by
interesting,
so there could be a blizzard, 100-mile-an-hour winds,
and you wouldn't even hear it.
With rain and lightning, and you could hear a pin drop in there.
Now it was
amazing.
I understand when it actually the fire happened. What 85 was
85
it?
March 5th or something like that.
I understand only a third of it burnt down.
Yeah, it didn't completely burn. The recording studio itself survived. The control room completely burnt inside. All the equipment, the Neve, the Studer, the Ampex, all the tape machines. The glass was broken by the fire department, but they threw an axe through the glass, and it probably made the fire spread. But they saved the recording studio. But all the recording equipment burned.
But he didn't rebuild.
He never rebuilt. In fact, I went back.
We're speaking of Jim Guercio.
Jim Guercio never rebuilt the place. He thought, this is it. I'm going to raise my kids up here.
Well, you know what? In the near future, we're going to kind of continue with what we're talking about here and maybe some more insight, because really Caribou Ranch was known around the world, and the artists, which are numerous, some of the top names in recording and show business and music business in general, recorded up there and recorded. I think there's an estimate they had 150
Grammys.
Yeah, Grammys.
Tunes that were done there.
Oh,
sure.
Just some significant recording went on
when
there.
You're talking about Elton John or Frank Zappa or Chicago and the Beach Boys, Dan Fogelberg, Sheena Easton. Yeah, you name it. Chris Christopherson.
The list is impressive, to say the least.
I heard over 100 million albums sold out from Caribou.
Was it 100 million?
Could be.
100 recorded in Caribou, 100 million sales and albums recorded.
Everybody probably.
Yeah. My goodness, that's an impressive number.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I know we're limited on time today, and so.
I know
in the near future, let's get back together. And Clark, did you have a question for John?
Well, I always have a lot of questions for John because I'm always intrigued with what goes on up at the ranch. And, I think it's an amazing place that I was actually be able to become friends with Johnny and be able to do a few projects with Johnny at the end of the last
Well,
run
when I
with him,
found out Clark had the Olive board, which was the first board that Chicago actually used for their 6th album, Just You and Me, Feeling Stronger.
Yeah, well, those are two top 10 hits.
Wishing You Were Here.
I think you told me that when Elton John, they came out, that his producer wanted you guys to get a Neve. And so Jimmy's like, okay, whatever it takes to get Elton to get out here, if we got to take the Olive out and get a Neve, we're going to do that.
We flew a Neve in from England.
Yeah, that was actually owned by Apple. From
Apple, we got it through them. George Martin, I believe, helped get it. But
so it's Beatles.
And that thing came in, they had to take it out of the crate because it wouldn't fit on the plane. And they flew it over, and that thing was set up within 24 hours. It was fired up and running.
Yeah. And so that's how he got the Neve that then...
And I think Earth, Wind & Fire did That's the Way of the World on that.
Possibly.
My goodness. Kind of to wrap up things, one thing I was reading that some of the motive for not rebuilding the studio was that digital recording was starting to come into play. And the analog was showing
a little bit. The studio burned in 85, so digital was... in the baby stages, I suppose. But there was still a lot of analog going on, but then in the 90s where it really happened, but the studio was gone and Jim just didn't rebuild. He had, he thought about it, but he ended up doing CMT in Nashville, so he was doing other stuff.
Well, he established a legacy here in Colorado, and a lot of people benefited. And
when you've got Elton John showing up to Nederland, Colorado, or Stevie Wonder, or John Lennon.
Oh, my gosh.
Where are we? And the English bands used to go, boy, you guys got a lot of room in this country. When you look at the mountains.
Well, you know what? We're going to continue this. There's a lot of nice information. And
I'm always back in Colorado.
Oh. So we're lucky to have you here.
Oh, I'm lucky to be here.
For you to play a part in the history of recording in Colorado certainly is significant. And I would also say that being inducted in the Colorado Music Hall of Fame, which this year, as I mentioned earlier, Dan Fogelberg, Joe Walsh, and Barnstorm, and Caribou Ranch Recording Studio, they've been inducted in the Colorado Music Hall of Fame. And by the way, up at Red Rocks is where the actual, what'd you call it, museum?
Trading post.
Trading post.
Trading post, and there's a museum up there.
Yeah, and if you get a chance to go up there and visit, there's a lot, an incredible history of musicians, songwriters, and performers that are noted up there. So if you are traveling through or in the Colorado vicinity, make sure you go up there and check this out. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time with a little bit more about things and life in Colorado, and certainly about the recording industry in Colorado.
Good to me.
Thank you.